Now the War and Peace Report. I'm Juan Gonzalez. The House Judiciary Committee held historic hearings on Friday about whether the White House overstepped its constitutional authority during the presidency of George W. Bush and whether or not such abuses would justify his impeachment. The hearing was billed as one on executive power and its constitutional limitations. Although the title expressly did not include the word impeachment, several Democratic Congress members and witnesses used the opportunity to begin impeachment proceedings against the president and vice president. Over 11 witnesses were called to testify at the 6-hour hearing, including Ohio Democrat Dennis Kucinich, who has repeatedly introduced articles of impeachment in Congress. Other witnesses included attorneys Vincent Bugliosi, Bruce Fein, and Elizabeth Holtzman, as well as former Georgia Republican and current Libertarian presidential candidate Bob Barr. The witnesses also included conservative law professor Stephen Pressner from Northwestern University and Jeremy Rapkin of George Mason University. Today we bring you excerpts from those hearings. We begin with Elizabeth Holtzman, a former Democratic Congresswoman from New York and two-term district attorney in Brooklyn. She is the author of several books, including The Impeachment of George W. Bush.
I think the question for this committee is what is to be done now and what can be done now. Prosecution is unrealistic. The administration will never prosecute itself. Truth commissions, the administration will stonewall them, as they have so many committees of Congress. So what is the realistic remedy? The only remedy, and that's the one the framers gave to the Congress of the United States, the House and the Senate, is the remedy of impeachment, because no one can interfere with it. You ask the president or the vice president to give you the contents of the FBI statement. They don't do that. That becomes an impeachable offense. You could ask them to provide them the information under oath. You may not be able to finish the task, but you certainly can start the task, which will send an important signal, not just to this president, but to future presidents.
If President George W. Bush had knocked to enter the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, the presiding officer, President George Washington, would have denied him admission, and thereby hangs an alarming tale. The executive branch has vandalized the Constitution every bit as much as the barbarians sacked Rome in 410 AD. The executive branch has destroyed the Constitution's time-honored checks and balances, taken the nation perilously close to executive despotism. The executive branch rejects the basic philosophical tenets of the United States of America. It does not accept that America was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that sovereignty in a Republican form of government lies with the people, not with the executive. That there are no vassals or serfs in the Constitution's landscape. That every man and woman is a king or queen, but no one wears a crown. And that the rule of law is the nation's civic religion. And the Founding Fathers fashioned impeachment as a remedy for attacks against the constitutional order.
On December 9th, 1998, a previous House Judiciary Committee issued 4 articles of impeachment against President Bill Clinton for doing something infinitely less significant than what the evidence shows the Bush administration did in this case. Indeed, it is a calumny, a slander of the highest rank, to even talk about them in the same breath or on the same page. If a House Judiciary Committee could recommend that President Clinton be impeached for what he did, as they say in the law, a fortiori, all the more so, with all the highly incriminating evidence that I set forth in my book, much of it documentary, you shouldn't have any difficulty making a criminal referral to the Department of Justice to commence a criminal investigation of the Bush administration to determine whether first-degree murder charges should be brought against certain members of this administration. And I hereby strongly urge you to do so. Whether Republican or Democrat, all Americans should be absolutely outraged over what the Bush administration has done. How dare they do what they did? How dare they?
Vincent Bugliosi at Friday's hearings on the limits of executive power. Several Democratic Congress members also spoke out in favor of impeachment, including Congressman Dennis Kucinich of Ohio, Congresswoman Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, also Hank Johnson of Georgia, and Congressman Robert Wexler of Florida.
Never before in the history of this nation has an administration so successfully diminished the constitutional powers of the legislative branch. It is unacceptable, and it must not stand. This is not how our founders so carefully and delicately designed our democracy. in a deliberate effort to reduce the power of this Congress and obstruct our ability to provide oversight over the executive branch, President Bush has ordered Karl Rove, Harriet Miers, Josh Bolten, and other administration officials to simply ignore Congress by refusing to testify. This failure of administration witnesses to even appear is unprecedented in the history of our nation. The Bush White House has distorted the concept of executive privilege beyond recognition in order to hide White House wrongdoings. Faced with this litany of wrongful actions, I am convinced that the most appropriate response to this unprecedented behavior is to hold hearings for impeachment. The power of impeachment, the power of impeachment, which our founding fathers provided to the House of Representatives, was designed precisely for this type of wrongdoing. I fully recognize the significance of holding impeachment hearings, and I have not come to this position lightly, not one bit. But when an administration takes actions that amount to high crimes, we, the representatives of the people, are left with no option other than to seek impeachment and removal from office. Our government was founded by a delicate balance of powers, whereby one branch carefully checks the other branches to prevent a dangerous consolidation of power. The actions of this White House have eviscerated this careful balance. This is not a Democratic or Republican issue. This is an American issue. Without these checks and balances, a president can run roughshod over any law with impunity. Congress must end this disturbing pattern of behavior. And in these circumstances, unfortunately, the only option left is impeachment hearings. We have been down this road before. Yes, we have. In 1973, articles of impeachment were introduced against President Nixon after he inappropriately tried to use executive privilege to bury evidence of his wrongdoings. I think it would be helpful to delve more deeply into what happened during the Nixon administration, particularly as it relates to the obstruction of the oversight powers of this Congress.
While, Mr. Chairman, today's hearing is not an impeachment hearing, I fear that in the event that the current administration continues with its secret actions with motives and purposes that are not known or not revealed, if this administration during the last 6 months decides to attack the sovereign nation of Iran, then Americans will look back and think and rethink whether or not it would have been worth pursuing impeachment at this time to deter any further misdoing by this administration.
The American public expects no less. We, the people, conferred upon the branches of government limited and defined power and provided for meaningful checks and balances. Over the past several years, serious questions have been raised about the conduct of high-ranking administration officials in relation to some of the most basic elements of our democracy: respect for the rule of law, the principle of checks and balances, and the fundamental freedoms enshrined in the Bill of Rights. In other words, the American people are in doubt as to whether administration officials have fulfilled their oaths of office to preserve, protect, and defend our Constitution. And their concerns are not insignificant. Americans want to know whether our nation's highest-ranking officials broke the law to justify the invasion of Iraq. Many in our nation and around the world wonder whether today the Bush White House is planning to illegally attack Iran. They wonder, too, whether their private conversations are being listened to by government officials unconcerned about restraints placed upon them by the Constitution, whether our nation is holding individuals in secret prisons, denying them even the right to appear before a judge or to be represented by an attorney or to confront their accusers. They wonder who authorized torture and rendition. They wonder whether this administration will forever change what it means to be an American.
Congressmember Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin testifying at Friday's House Judiciary hearing on impeachment. That does it for today's program, and a correction to one of our headlines. We earlier stated that Congressmember Dennis Kucinich said New York City officials could have overvalued the new Yankee Stadium site at 7 times its actual price. That figure was actually revealed in my column in the New York Daily News today. If you want to get a copy of the show, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. I'm Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Democracy Now! And Amy will be returning next week from her long-deserved vacation.
Musician Franco. I'm Amy Goodman here with Juan Gonzalez.
And welcome to all of you out there listening in or hearing the streaming on the internet. In the last few months, mainstream human rights groups have been calling for top U.S. officials in the Bush administration to be held accountable for the torture and abuse of military prisoners at U.S. detention centers around the world. In April, Human Rights Watch demanded that a special prosecutor be named to investigate Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, former CIA Director George Tenet, and other top officials for possible war crimes related to the abuse. Last month, Amnesty International issued a damning report blasting the Bush administration for ignoring international law and mistreating detainees. The group criticized the Bush administration for failing to carry out a full and independent investigation of the torture at Abu Ghraib and for failing to hold any senior officials accountable.
Well, The Nation magazine is publishing an article in its July 18th issue called Torture and Accountability. The author, former Congressmember Elizabeth Holtzman, writes, "There is precedent to hold U.S. officials accountable for wrongdoing." She points to public pressure that forced Congress to end the Vietnam War, relentless press coverage of the Watergate scandal, which ultimately led to Nixon's resignation, and public demands that led to the independent 9/11 Commission. Former Congressmember Holtzman served for 8 years from New York and won national attention for her role on the House Judiciary Committee during Watergate. She was subsequently elected District Attorney of Brooklyn, the only woman ever elected DA in New York City, and served 8 years there. She's also the only woman ever elected Controller of New York City. We turn now to Elizabeth Holtzman. Welcome to Democracy Now! Well, it has been very interesting to read this article and also look at your background from dealing with the issue of Holocaust war crimes to Watergate to now talking about torture and accountability. Can you relate all three?
Well, I think we need justice in this world. We need to make sure that people who commit horrendous crimes are held accountable, and we need to have social justice as well. But I got to Congress in 1973, when nobody had any clue that Richard Nixon would ever be held accountable in connection with the Watergate break-in that took place just a few months before that. And then it was because of a lot of independent and relentless prosecutors and judges and, most important, press, and in the end, the American public, that a president of the United States was held accountable for something that nobody could have dreamed months before that he would be held accountable for, and his top administration officials. And it seems to me that with the terrible scandal Abu Ghraib, that we can't, as they tried in Watergate to do, cut off the investigation at the small fry, at the lowest level. You have to look, and the international law precedents and American law requires that you look up the chain of command. What I discovered by accident was that this is not a concern that I have alone. President Bush's White House counsel, Alberto Gonzales, himself, who's now the Attorney General of the United States, wrote a memo in January 2002 to President Bush saying, one of the reasons we need to opt out of the Geneva Conventions wasn't just because they didn't like the Geneva Conventions because they don't like treaties. But he said we have to worry about prosecutions under the U.S. War Crimes Act of 1996. That, it turns out, is a federal statute that applies to any U.S. national, military or civilian, high or low, who violates the Geneva Conventions in certain ways. In other words, who engages in murder, torture, or inhuman treatment. And it's not just those who engage in it, it's those who order it or those who, knowing about it, fail to take steps to stop it. That means higher ups.
No, this 1996 law is not very well known.
No, it's totally obscure. I only found out about it because Alberto Gonzales was worried about prosecutions of high-level officials under it.
What brought this law about? In other words, was Congress
What
reacting
happened was in the 1990s, during the, I guess it was the Clinton administration at that time, Congress decided that it wanted to adopt laws to take it into full compliance with its obligations under an international torture statute and an international torture treaty and the Geneva Conventions. And so it passed two laws. One is a statute making it a U.S. crime to engage in torture. It was passed 2 years before the 1996 law. And then you have the War Crimes Act of 1996. And basically what it does, it makes grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions a federal crime. Got it? Just like kidnapping or interstate burglary or child pornography, it is a federal crime. And the other thing that's interesting is that it carries the death penalty. If death results from torture or inhuman treatment, then there is a death penalty, and that means there's no statute of limitations. That means that if any high-level official violates the War Crimes Act and somebody died, they can be prosecuted. They are subject to prosecution for the rest of their lives.
So what did Gonzales do about President Bush?
Well, what Gonzales did to President Bush, he said, Mr. President, we've got to worry about prosecutions under this statute, and what we can do is we can reduce the possibility of prosecutions by opting out of the Geneva Conventions. And guess what? The President opted out of the Geneva Conventions. He followed the advice of Gonzales. And by the way, the same advice was given by Attorney General Ashcroft in a memo to the President as well, saying that he wanted to make sure that law enforcement officials, intelligence officials, and others were not prosecuted under the War Crimes Act. So here we have two high-level U.S. government officials warning President Bush that the War Crimes Act, a U.S. statute, could make high-level American officials criminally liable if they unless they opted out of Geneva Convention.
You make a distinction between Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and what happened in those two places.
I don't make a distinction from the point of view of international law. What I'm saying is that even if you accept what Gonzales' solution was, he said, Mr. President, look, if we opt out of Geneva, we reduce the possibility of prosecution. And the Justice Department is saying, look, if we change the definition of torture, so torture doesn't mean what it normally means, but it's something Orwellian, if you just grant them that, just say, okay, we'll accept for argument's sake that you're right about that. They are still liable for the inhuman treatment that took place in Iraq, because we never opted out of Geneva for Iraq. So if you look at Abu Ghraib, and you look at who ordered that, or you look at who knew about it and failed to stop it, or you look at CIA interrogations, not of Al-Qaeda. Let's just leave that aside because we don't want to get into a legal argument with them about that. You have the possibility that the highest level officials of the United States government could be criminally liable under this statute, and that's exactly what Mr. Gonzales was worried about. Now, Attorney General of the United States, that's exactly what Mr. Ashcroft, then Attorney General of the United States, were worried about. And nobody has looked at this statute in that kind of fashion to see that accountability can be had and really should be had with regard to the highest level people in the United States government.
But what about the situation in Guantanamo, given especially the Supreme Court rulings that the federal law does apply in Guantanamo? Does the Bush administration's decision to opt out of the Geneva Conventions in Afghanistan affect those prisoners who then become transferred to Guantanamo?
I'm not a legal expert on that. I'm just saying, personally, it seems to me that that's a very bad argument, that you're just going to create a legal loophole so that people can commit what they know to be crimes. But what I'm saying is a different point, that you can hold, whether it's for what happened in Abu Ghraib or what happened in Guantanamo, we still can hold people, highest level government officials, accountable for inhuman treatment and for torture in the normal sense of the word, if we, under the War Crimes Act of 1996, and give them the benefit of the doubt of every argument they want to make. There's still a whole universe of abuse and mistreatment for which our government officials need to be held accountable.
Let's talk about chain of command. General Ricardo Sanchez, it looks like, is about to be promoted the commander in Iraq when the Abu Ghraib abuses took place.
Well, it seems to me that that raises very, very serious questions. Obviously, we know that he did order for at least a short period of time abuses that would constitute inhuman treatment. Do they constitute criminal actions? The Senate of the United States is going to have confirmation hearings if he's promoted, and they must look into this very seriously. In fact, what I would suggest to the Senate is that they require before he's confirmed, or as a condition of considering his confirmation, that a special prosecutor or an independent counsel be appointed to examine whether there is criminal liability of him or any other higher-up in connection with Abu Ghraib.
You also raised in the Nation article the whole question of the direct role of President Bush himself, and what directives did he issue in relationship to treatment of prisoners that have so far not been revealed. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, the president always says that he's against torture, but let's step back and recognize that this administration has come out with a definition of torture that is totally unacceptable, which is one of the reasons that the War Crimes Act is so useful, because it also has, as a predicate for liability, inhuman treatment. You don't have to go to where they are on torture. But he issued his orders with regard to how prisoners were to be treated in Afghanistan, explicitly excluded the CIA. He said, we're supposed to treat prisoners humanely and something to the extent of if it's militarily appropriate. But there was no limitation on anything to do with the CIA questioning. And so we have the indication that that he might have been sending some signal to the CIA that you're not bound by the requirements of humane treatment. That's one of the indications that we have.
Former Congressmember Liz Holtzman is our guest today. We're going to break and then come back and talk about also how this goes back in her history, talking about World War II, and also ask her about the Holocaust analogies that have been made as she continues to be part of a federal panel that seeks documents on World War II crimes. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, music by Madlib. Democracy Now! Broadcasting on over 350 stations around the country, Pacifica and NPR stations, low-power FM stations, public access TV stations, and PBS stations, also both TV satellite networks. On Dish Network Channel 9415, Free Speech TV, 9410, Link TV, and on DirecTV as well, Channel 375, with video and audio stream at democracynow.org, closed caption for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, and our headlines are in Spanish on our website, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest is Liz Holtzman, served for 8 years as U.S. Congress member from New York, served on the House Judiciary Committee that voted to impeach Richard Nixon, and also continues to serve on a federal panel investigating Nazi war atrocities. Let's talk about that. What about the information you're getting there? I'm actually interested in an update on that, and then how that relates to today.
Well, again, it was a battle of a couple of members of Congress who wanted to get the full truth about U.S. Knowledge of Nazi war crimes both during the war and after the war, and our dealings with Nazi war criminals during the war and after the war. And initially, as you can imagine, a lot of federal agencies said, can't do, won't do, not computerized, too much work. But the fact of the matter is almost every single agency has fully complied. Defense Department has turned over documents. National Security Agency has turned over documents. FBI has turned over documents. 8 million pages of documents. And the CIA drew a line in the sand, basically said it was not going to turn over documents dealing with their relationship with Nazi war criminals after the war, but now they've agreed to comply with the law and to do what the other agencies have done. What it shows is, and what some of the documents show, is that a couple things. We knew, the U.S. government and the British at the same time knew, for example, that the Jewish community of Rome was going to be rounded up by the Nazis, and we can't find any action that was taken to warn the community, to tell the Germans not to do it. I mean, it suggests that the U.S. government failed to help a community that was at risk, big community. Secondly, after the war, Nazi war criminals worked for the United States government, and we knew about it. In fact, some of the documents that we now have received show that the U.S. knew explicitly. I mean, for example, one of Eichmann's aides, who was responsible for rounding up the Jews of Holland, the CIA wanted to work with him after the war. Didn't care about his background.
What do you mean work with him?
Use him. I mean, what happened after the war was, and we know this from a case involving Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, the Germans said, how can we, the high German officials, SS officers said, how can we save our necks? We've now lost the war. Germany's lost the war. How can we save our necks? And what happened was that they went to the British and they went to the Americans and they said, we're not really Nazis. We're just really anti-communists. We want to work for you. And the U.S. government said, great. And Klaus Barbie was the first and only case that we knew about in detail where the U.S. government employed him, U.S. officials committed crimes, and then sneaked him out of Europe. But what we are now documenting is that there were hundreds and hundreds of others. And worse yet is that the hiring of these people, you know, everyone says, and it applies to today, everyone says we have to be macho, we have to use bad guys to get good intelligence. The fact of the matter is, by using Nazi war criminals, we may have exposed ourselves, first of all, because these were people who had blood on their hands and were liable to blackmail by the Russians, and the Russians, in fact, totally penetrated the West German spy apparatus because they had Nazi war criminals working for them. And secondly, these people had an agenda. They wanted to keep their necks from being cut off. And so sometimes they would give us biased intelligence. So the consequences of using, quote unquote, the bad guys are stuff that is something that's going to occupy historians and will show us that there were huge risks and huge problems aside from the moral issue of whether these people should have been saved from justice and allowed to and hired to work for us.
Now, your panel, what is it doing precisely? It is reviewing the...
It beats up on, in a word, it beats up on federal agencies. It says you have to turn over these documents. Congress has ordered these documents. And, of course, the agencies say, they initially said no. And later the CIA said no, but we work with them or against them, and we get them finally to do what has to be done. And so this is the biggest declassification project that the government is
But does your panel actually review the documents itself? Or
we do sometimes. The problem is there are 8 million of them, and we don't. We have a teeny-weeny budget, basically no budget. But we have had historians. We have 3 historians who work for us, and they help us, first of all, explain to the agencies why they have to turn over the documents. And they did look at 250,000 documents, and there's a book that's now published that's been put out working with the National Archives called U.S. Intelligence and the Nazis, that was written by these three historians based on only 250,000 pages. But we assume that this is a treasure trove for historians for the years.
And do you have a sense to what degree the United States government protected the Nazis once they had left Germany from prosecution from war crimes tribunals?
Well, we know, yes, we know some of them were protected, and we know that some of them were hired by us, and we have some information about how they were protected. Yes, there's no question that in a number of cases, and it's not only those who left Germany, it's those who were in Germany, or those who were in Austria, or those who were in Italy.
So are the Nuremberg trials for those who simply wouldn't cooperate with the U.S.?
No, the Nuremberg trials were those at the highest level, the very highest level. But the SS officers, particularly the intelligence officers, were people that we wanted to hire, and we did. And we created an apparatus. I mean, there's a very well-known man called Reinhard Gehlen who created the West German spy network. He was Hitler's chief of intelligence on the Eastern Front, which is where they killed most of the Jews who were killed, plus gypsies and partisans and the rest. I mean, what went on the Eastern Front in Russia and the Eastern Europe was terrible. He was our guy. We set him up. We found now that he had at least 100 Nazi war criminals working for him in his apparatus. This was an apparatus that was totally penetrated by the Russians. So what good did it? I mean, one, we have a moral issue about hiring these people, and two, it was totally penetrated. So it raises a question of, you do immoral things, and also you get a bad result.
What about the comparisons now? Senator Dick Durbin making his statement and then having to retract it. Those who make comparisons to the Nazis, those who make comparisons to talking about the gulag of detention centers from Afghanistan, from Guantanamo around the world.
Well, I think it's dangerous to draw connections between this and Soviet system or the Nazi system. I mean, Nazis killed 6 million Jews and millions of non-Jews. Millions were killed in the gulag. We're not talking about those numbers. But the idea that the ends justify the means, and the idea that you're willing to use brutality is something that was found in the Soviet system and is something that's found in the Nazi system and is abhorrent when it's found in our system.
And the documents that you are uncovering, they'll be available to the public?
They are available. The National Archives, we've made 8 million pages available, and more we've been extended for 2 years to deal with the CIA documents, so we believe there will be more. And not only Nazis, but Japanese war criminals, and you may know also with regard to the Japanese war criminals after World War II, there was a Japanese unit that was involved in germ warfare. And instead of prosecuting the head of that unit, we hired him.
Where did he go to work?
I don't know the details of that, but yeah, this is after it's amazing. During World War II, we ourselves, Americans, were terribly victimized by the Japanese as prisoners of war. That was the genesis of the Geneva Conventions and our support for them. We saw what happened to our own prisoners. And during World War II, we treated the German prisoners of war in a very humane way. And after World War II, somehow, the ends began to justify the means in U.S. policy.
Well, we want to thank you very much for being with us. Liz Holtzman has a piece out in the upcoming issue of the Nation magazine. It's called Torture and Accountability. Thank you for being with us. We're going to go to a brief music break and then continue our broadcast. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, and you can go to our website and sign up for our daily headlines that go out to tens of thousands of people around the world and link to other websites for information around the guests that we have on. Stay with us.
Surochi Saraswati
That's music from this